Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. This video is going to be kind of long, and I will try to keep it not as complex as it could be, but it might get a little dicey there. Because it's about a topic called gisho, which means fake text or fraudulent text. And it's also about a text called the Kujiki, also known as the Sendai Kujihongi. Now, when it comes to the topic of gisho, we're going to basically discuss, what it is and how the labeling of a text as gisho can be problematic. And then we're going to move into discussing the Kujiki and how it was one of the three main Shinto texts, but how it was deemed gisho in the late 1600s. Is this an accurate or fair assessment? Why did it happen? And will it ever go back to being considered non-gisho? This video will also contain some of my personal feelings on the topic and also how it fits into the material that we cover in this channel, or what is the connection with gisho text, or specifically the Kujiki and the Oboshiden and the Jingunden, etc., etc. Alright, so let's jump straight to it in an effort to keep the video length down. What are gisho documents? Any document that is considered fake or fraudulent. Basically, the term gisho essentially means fraudulent document. So that pretty much says it straight up. But what does it mean specifically? Specifically, the most common metric used to say that something is gisho is that the book is given authorship by someone other than the actual creator, in an effort to connect the text to that figure or person. Now I want to let that sink into your head for a minute, because if you really think about that primary metric, well, to be blunt, that's an extremely problematic primary metric, especially dealing with ancient text, because to be honest, almost all ancient text, especially religious documents, are written by later students and then attributed to the founder of the religion or to their ancestors, etc., etc. So by this primary metric, just about any ancient document, almost all ancient religious documents, could, in theory, be labeled gisho at any moment. And this is a very significant problem. Now I want you to see in red, I want you to remember this point, because it will come up again later in the video. The fact that the primary metric for gisho is that it is attributed to someone who's not the actual author being the primary metric, that could be applied to just about any ancient document, especially religious text. That is important to remember for this video. So, obviously the concept of gisho works best within our more modern time period, within our current time period, internet, modern day, the present time. So any documents that are written now that we can verify are not written by the person, then we can slap gisho on it, because it's all concurrently, it's all taking place concurrently. However, applying gisho to ancient documents becomes very damaging, especially to the ethno-history, because ultimately it is irrelevant if a document was genuinely authored by a particular historical figure or if it was created by the followers of that tradition over time. And this is because the document contains the teachings of the tradition regardless of who wrote it. And people would have lived and died within the knowledge of those teachings. So again, think of ancient religious texts that are supposedly written by this person or this person or whatever. We have no idea. There's no real way to know if that book goes back to that person. And in almost every case, we know that that person didn't actually write that text, that it's just been attributed to them. But because the text is legitimately containing the teaching or the doctrine of that religion, It stands, right? And that's the exact same, but that's the same problem when a document that is an ancient record or an ancient religious text is labeled gisho as fraudulent because it's not authored by the person it's supposed to have been written by. That is very, very problematic. And it really becomes problematic because, again, when a document is labeled as gisho, it gets a huge black mark against it, and it pretty much becomes shunned by the government and by the community, etc., etc. So, and you see in red, I want you to remember this. This is a very important point. The purpose of identifying a document as gisho is to shun the document and to effectively cancel the document. So, because gisho is such a powerful weapon, it's weaponized academia, essentially. It really should only be used when a document is clearly made up concurrently within the present time, and not when there's a long-standing tradition associated with it. You know, if a document's like 1,000 years old and there's been 1,000 years of culture and tradition built up around the document, it is destructive to just say, oh, it's a fake document, it's banned now. What about 1,000 years of tradition associated with a document, right? So a substantial amount of ethnohistory is shunned and ejected and lost when the sort of academia becomes weaponized against ancient documents. And furthermore, it shuns and disrespects the communities whose traditions are involved with the document. So in many ways, making a book gisho becomes an attack on that particular subculture due to the amount of fallout that comes from a document being labeled gisho. So now that you have a pretty good idea of what gisho is and the primary metric, so let's move on to, and now that you know that, we'll keep that in mind, and then we move on to the next part, which is the Kujiki, or the Sendai Kujihongi, aka the Kujiki. Now, most people are aware of the two main holy books of Shinto. They're often called the Kiki. It's the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, right? Everyone knows about these. These are well known, well studied. However, what most people do not know, especially a lot of Westerners and even some Japanese people, is that it used to actually be a trinity of holy books. There actually used to be 3 of these main books. It was the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki, and the Kujiki. The Kujiki was part of this triad of holy books for over 700 years. But in the late 1600s and into the early 1700s, the literati of the Mito domain, aka I've talked about these guys before, they're known as the Mito domain scholars, or pejoratively, the Mito domain thought police, they slapped the label of gisho onto the Kujiki, despite the fact that the Kujiki had been a Shinto book for, well, on the screen I say 1,000, not really 1,000, about 750, 800 years, give or take. It was one of the 3 holy books. So now you've got to imagine why then in the late 1600s and the early 1700s, why did one of the trinity of holy books, why was it suddenly attacked and labeled gisho after 750 years? So we're gonna actually, there's actually a very clear answer to this, and we'll get to it. But before we get to it, let's just examine a little bit of what the Kujiki is and also how it plays into like Jingunden and Oboshiden. Like why are we looking at this topic? All right. So the Kujiki is a 10-volume text. Now there are also several commentaries to the Kujiki, which were subsequently either deemed gisho as well, or basically just become sort of lost because the Kujiki is considered gisho. But we're focusing on the main text itself. It's a 10-volume text, and it begins in the Age of Gods and it ends with the histories of various families, and it has a lot of info on the Mononobe family. It is the fundamental document for Mononobe Ryu Shinto, or Mononobe style Shinto. Now in red, this is important too. Remember this. Comes up later. It was a major text of the Yoshida style Shinto. It was also supposedly written by Prince Shotoku. It was introduced in 936 by Yatabe no Kinmochi. There was a meeting of sort of religious scholars, and he introduced it, and he said that this book, the Kujiki, is believed to be the book that Prince Shotoku wrote in the 600s, and that it is the book of which the Nihon Shoki is based on. Now, the Nihon Shoki itself is legitimately clocked as having been based on a previous text. Supposedly, it was based on a previous text. Supposedly, there was a text that Prince Shotoku worked on. The catch was that text was allegedly lost in a fire a few decades after Shotoku's death. But Yatabe said that this book, the Kujiki, was the book that the Nihon Shoki was based on. And for 750 years, everyone considered the Kujiki legit, and it was used alongside the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. But then, in the 1600s, the Mito domain scholars labeled it gisho. So what happened? So before we move on, though, let's just take a moment to, dive into why you, the viewer, should care about this Kujiki. Well, the Tada Genji Jingunden, the Tada Genji Oboshiden, and sort of the traditions that come from that have a history, have an interwoven history with the Kujiki, with the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki as well, and the Kujiki. 3 Shinto texts that were all what was the triad of the Shinto text prior to the late 1600s. As a matter of fact, in video 34, I touched upon the Fukushima-ryu's Norito. That, remember, Fukushima-ryu is a shinobi tradition made by the Nojiri family. The Nojiri are Tada Genji, right? So Tada Genji tradition. That's why this channel is called Tada Genji tradition. And in the Fukushima-ryu, there was a spell. It was Hito Futo Mio, etc., etc., etc. Watch video 34 where I go more in depth on that technique that's in the Fukushima-ryu. But that technique, that chant, that comes from the Kujiki. And on the right, you'll see there's an excerpt from the Kujiki, and the arrows are pointing to the chant. Because remember, the Hito Futo Mio Itsumu, it's basically you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4. And then in video 34, I explain the sort of why you're counting, what the numbers mean. But also in a circle, I circle this because this chant, this counting, is related to 10 sacred treasures that are discussed in the Kujiki. Now, the 10 treasures are briefly mentioned in the Nihon Shoki, but it's the Kujiki that has a longer and more developed account. Now, these 10 sacred treasures are not the 3 treasures that become the imperial regalia. So the imperial regalia is 3 treasures. That's a different set of treasures. This is a set of 10 treasures that is given to a deity called Nigehayagi. Now, that deity's identity is a little bit obscure. It's the deity is either the brother of Ninigi or a son of Okuninushi. But regardless, and this is what's also interesting too. Later on in the video, I'm going to explain some of the accusations against the Kujiki and how they don't hold up. And this is one of those things where it doesn't hold up, because the Nihon Shoki and the Kujiki, the Kujiki has more data on the 10 treasures and has a different teaching about who the deity was, and the Nihon Shoki has a sort of a different approach to who the deity was and has very little teachings on it. So remember that. Okay, so now that you know what gisho is, and you know what the text is, and you know that it has some intertanglements with the Tada Genji tradition, which then also is like Kusanoki tradition and like Fukushima Ryu Ninjitsu, etc., etc. So now we're going to move into the issues. So the issues that were raised against the text, of which it was labeled gisho, but then we're also going to basically point out why these issues are very weak and ultimately ridiculous. And then we're going to look at why these charges, what was really behind it. So let's start with issue number 1. The prologue being attributed to Shotoku, basically saying that Shotoku wrote the Kujiki. The Mito domain scholars simply don't believe it, and they call it a lie. It's fake. You're attributing it to Prince Shotoku. He didn't write it, therefore it's fake text, right? The problem with this is that the prologue was almost certainly added at a later date. The idea that the Kujiki came from Shotoku is very possibly something that was added to it later. Even when Yatabe claimed that this was the text that came from Shotoku, that came, and you'll see later, we'll get into the history of the text, but even that is more conjecture than anything. It's a very weak point. It's ultimately impossible to prove or disprove if the document came from Shotoku, if Shotoku was involved in writing this document or not, but it's irrelevant ultimately, because the attribution to Shotoku is almost certainly a later attribution, and again, it's ultimately irrelevant. Issue number 2 that was charged against it is that the usage of Chinese names for the early emperors. Now this is fair. I mean, this is fair. If the document was ancient, it was from the 600s, it would not use the Chinese names. The problem is that the usage of Chinese names almost certainly could be attributed to later edits of the document, because as we'll get into later, we know the document was edited multiple times. On top of that, even if the document doesn't actually go back to Shotoku, right, it still doesn't mean the document does not go back to the 700s or the 800s. The document, we know the document absolutely existed in the 900s. And as we'll get into further in the video, the Japanese scholar who's considered the authority of the document believes that the document goes back to the 800s. So yes, the document may not really go back to Shotoku. That part may be myth, but it's an incredibly ridiculous reason to cancel the document. Issue number 3. The claim is that the Kujiki cuts and pastes sections from the Nihon Shoki. Now this one is the most egregious and absurd claim. So this is one of the main claims, that it is literally just pieces of the Nihon Shoki repackaged. And it's absolutely not true. This is verifiably false. Both documents contain similar entries, but there's no cut and paste of anything. The Kujiki is actually less grammatically skillful and less poetic than the Nihon Shoki. Another way to say it, the Kujiki is a little cruder than the Nihon Shoki. Also, when you compare them side by side, there is literally no cut and paste copying. No one has copied the Nihon Shoki. They only discuss similar topics, but in many cases, now remember I said this earlier in the video, like with the 10 treasures, in many cases the information doesn't match. Right? The Kujiki has different information than the Nihon Shoki in many cases. So the claim that the Kujiki is just sections of the Nihon Shoki repackaged is false. And that is really all about it boils down to those 3 issues. It's that it claims to be from Shotoku. Well, it's not from Shotoku, must be fake. It claims to be old. Well, it can't be that. It can't be as old as it's supposed to be because it has the Chinese names for the sort of the older emperors. All right. Well, okay, that's true. But it doesn't mean that could be an edit later, or that could just mean, okay, it wasn't written by Shotoku in 600, but we know that it definitely exists in the 900s, right? And then the idea that and then ultimately it's just something that's you should throw away because it's just a repackage of the Nihon Shoki. That's false. That is just completely false. At no point does the Kujiki cut and paste copy the Nihon Shoki. They just talk about similar events because they're literally talking about the same history, but the material is very different. The Mito domain scholars, however, led by Tokugawa Mitsukuni, decided that these 3 points were sufficient enough to dismiss the book from the Shinto canon. So the problem here is that a lot of people, a lot of samurai, actually used the Kujiki as a Shinto holy text because it was one of the 3 main texts. Its sudden ejection from the canon is very problematic because, see, when the government ejects it, it basically loses all of its protection, right? And people are less apt to sell copies or make copies. Shrines that are based around the Kujiki have to reorganize. Book printers stop making copies because, the government says that's a fake book. So now, and then sort of groupthink kicks in and everybody's like, oh, that's a fake text. It's fake. We have to shun the text. Right, and then it even carries on to this day, right? Because since the mid-Edo period, the late 1600s into the 1700s, Japanese academics don't want to touch it, and the very few that do address it, they always take a biased stance from the very beginning. They don't start from a blank slate. When they start, they always start with the idea of, I am investigating a fake book, right? So that bias is immediately present. Does you understand the difference? Like when an academic wants to study a text, they should start at a blank spot and let the data lead the way. But Japanese academics, since the mid-Edo period, have always started from the position of, this is a fake book. And that has flavored and just destroyed all the study and academic study and just the social life of this text. And honestly, this is a problem with Japanese academics. Once the system has decided something is bad, very few will dare risk their social standing and their careers to touch it. Without going into a complex history of the job of a historian in Japanese history, let's just say that there's some issues there. And so basically, to be blunt, once a text is identified as gisho, Japanese academics don't want to touch it. Like I said, and if they do, they don't want to touch it because it could put their career at risk, right? And if regardless of how valuable a document might be in regards to its ethno-history and the tradition around it, once it's deemed gisho, it's dead for any real academic study. And like I said, those that want to investigate and study it, they always have to start with the belief that it is fake, and they must tread carefully because they don't want to get labeled as a weirdo for working on the document. That sort of public shunning, that's real, right? And this is the very definition of shunning, right? Now remember this point. Remember this point because this goes into why this really happened. All right, but what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some scholars who have approached it. Now, one of them is Japanese, and we're actually going to look at 3 non-Japanese who dared venture into the Kujiki. Now, as we know, the Mito domain scholars labeled it as gisho, and there have been a handful of Japanese academics who have basically reiterated the points. They didn't really do anything new, to be honest. They just reiterated the same point. Oh, it's fake because of these reasons. But the one Japanese academic who is now considered the authority on the topic in Japan, Kamata Junichi, his writings, they are considered the definitive end of the topic, right? He is the authority on it. What he says is the law. It's done. As far as Japanese academia is concerned, his writings is the end of the discussion. Like I said, many others padded their careers by rehashing the same attacks, but Kamata actually dared to support it somewhat and managed to maintain his good standing. And what could have been a career ruiner turned out to actually solidify him as the master of this topic. His final verdict is that the Kujiki was an edited version of an older document. And he believed that there was a proto Kujiki. Now, he did not believe that it was from the 600s, and he did not believe it was written by Shotoku, but he believed the original document was written in the 800s. So, I mean, that's a big deal because the Mito domain scholars said it's gisho, burn it, get rid of it, forget it ever happened, right? But Kamata is saying now again, this is the guy, all right? This is the guy. He holds final say on this topic now. Now he's a modern historian though. He's not he's not like a he wasn't in the Mito domain days. He's a more modern historian. But his final findings is that the Kojiki comes from the 900s and it is an edited version of an older document from the 800s. So, again, it's not from 600s, it's not from Shotoku, but it is a Shinto holy text from the 800s. Now, you would think, okay, that's spot on. That's awesome, right? Isn't this enough to remove the label of gisho and the stigma and allow the document to return as being one of the trinity of holy books? No, actually, sorry guys, it's not. That's not how this works. Once a book is labeled gisho, like I said, it's a death mark. Okay? It's done. Like, basically, it will probably never not be considered gisho, even though the Japanese authority has deemed that it is in fact a genuine text from the 800s. Still, it's not gonna not be gisho. It's done. Like again, that's a death mark. Now let's look at those Japanese, the non-Japanese guy. We looked at Kamata because he's the guy in Japan. Now let's look at some foreigners who have looked at the text. So in 1955, non-Japanese G.W. Robinson underwent a very deep dive into the Kujiki, and he laid out a model of his theory that the document is comprised of four parts, which is basically four stages of document. The oldest part, the next oldest part, etc., etc. So for a document that is actually built in four stages. And he laid it all out. And it began to form this picture of a document that was edited over time, etc., etc. But since the Kujiki has been labeled gisho, and since Robinson is a foreigner, he's not Japanese, his work was doomed to not change anything. So he lays out this great study, he studies it, and he lays out this great argument, and just crickets. Nobody cares. He's not Japanese, and the document is gisho. Nobody cares what he has to say. There's another guy named Bentley, another non-Japanese scholar, and he recently worked on a 500-page book that defended the Kujiki, and it broke the Kujiki. It breaks down a lot of these sort of weak attacks against it. But again, not being Japanese and fighting against the gisho label, his work hasn't caused any response in Japan either. It's just not going to happen. These are foreigners, and it's gisho. They could write thousands of pages. It's not going to change anything. The only person to respond to Bentley's book is another non-Japanese, and I don't know how to pronounce his name. You can see it on the screen. Mark T. We'll just call him Mark T. He wrote an article, about a 10-page article. It's a 10-page academic article, kind of a review of Bentley's book. And he criticized some of Bentley's approach, but he also admitted that there's a lot of points Bentley could be correct on. But unfortunately, a lot of the points you're really kind of unable to really prove or disprove the points. For example, like Bentley obtained a copy of the Kujiki that Bentley believes to be an older copy. But Mark T believes that it's an Edo period attempt to circumvent some of the accusations from the Mito domain scholars. Although Mike T doesn't really supply any reason for this. in his article, he literally just says like, yeah, I think it's a younger document. I think it's a later Edo document. But he does it. He gives no reason for it. It's just that's what he thinks, right? So again, it's in the end, but in the end, Mark Tees admits that because all known copies were clearly edited and handled by the Watari family, which is part of the Yoshida Shinto. Again, remember this. Because the Watari family, which is Yoshida style Shinto, has its hands all over the Kujiki, there's no way to ever really solve the issue because every copy is an edited copy. Now again, Bentley says his copy is an older copy that's not that is not been touched by the Watari. But Mark T then says, no, I don't. I think that's bullshit. I think that it's a copy, a later copy. So again, there's a lot of people's thoughts and feelings going back and forth. But ultimately, most of the points that Bentley raises and that Mark T raise, they really can't be proven one way or another. And ultimately, all of this work from these foreigners is irrelevant because despite all of their work and all of their arguing and all of their debate, these three men are not Japanese. And even if, like I said earlier, even if their work had produced amazing results, the Japanese academics just would not use it. And that is because Japanese academics will never allow a non-Japanese to take the lead on matters such as the authenticity of Shinto holy books. Right? And honestly, that's not even just a Japanese thing. That's just anybody, like not like the people whose documents the culture comes from are never going to look for outsiders to tell them what their own stuff is, right? So, obviously that, that's not some people may think this is a critique of Japanese culture. It's not a critique of Japanese culture. It's just the way that people in the world behave. They don't let outsiders take the lead on these things. Also, most Japanese academics, to be honest, most Japanese academics have given up on even the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, right? Let's be honest, the trend in Japan is that the academics have dropped the legendary books, and the focus and the current trends and focus is on non-legendary history, aka archaeology, right? Like the quote unquote what really happened versus what the stories say happened. And then finally, the third reason that none of it's going to mean anything is because, again, the document was labeled gisho, and labeling a document gisho is meant to kill a document, and it does. It does what it's supposed to do. Once it was labeled gisho, that's it. Nobody cares. Now that we've discussed what gisho is, what the Kujiki is, and sort of the controversy surrounding it, etc., let's look into why it was actually labeled gisho. Because to be honest, the Nihon Shoki could be labeled gisho by the same metrics. The Kojiki could be labeled gisho by the same metrics. Almost any ancient book in Japan, especially the holy books, could all be labeled gisho by these metrics. Why the Kujiki, after 750 years, why was it attacked? The answer is actually very blatant. The motive is very clear. And for that, we're going to start with a text written by Tada Yoshitoshi called Kujiki Gisho Mei Shoko. And it's very clear. In Yoshitoshi's text, he says, the Kujiki is made up by the Urabe clan and used by their descendants, which is the Yoshida, the Watari, the guys who are in charge of the Yoshida style Shinto, in order to control Shinto. So, let's just jump straight to the motive, because here it is. The Kujiki was labeled gisho in an effort to crush the power of the Yoshida style Shinto. So let's examine that further, because that's the answer. The answer is the Kujiki was executed to disempower the Yoshida style Shinto. But now let's examine that further. In the late 1600s, Shinto was in a serious need of revitalization. Now, if you, the viewer, have watched my Kumazawa videos, and actually in one of my Shinobi videos I discussed this too, in the late 1600s, Shinto was in a really bad spot. It needed revitalization. Kumazawa Banzan even has written documents, has written works calling for a revitalization of Shinto, etc., etc., etc. So, it's true. Shinto was in a bad state in the late 1600s. So a handful of Shinto scholars get together, and all of these scholars are those guys who would eventually level the charges upon the Kujiki until it became officially labeled gisho. These guys got together and they agreed they needed to do something about the sorry state of Shinto in the late 1600s. And they calculated that the blame lied on the Yoshida-style Shinto. At the time, the Yoshida-style Shinto was incredibly powerful, and they were in control of Shinto at the time. Basically, the government had made the Yoshida-style Shinto the style of Shinto, right? These are the guys. They call the shots. The Yoshida, in order to reform Shinto, the Yoshida-style Shinto would need a massive blow against them that would strip them of a lot of their power and a lot of their sway over Shinto. So, if you remember earlier in the video, I said, remember this, the Yoshida-style Shinto, particularly the Watari branch of the family, okay, of the style, they were a major proponent of the Kujiki. The Kujiki was their primary focus. That Kujiki was their bread and butter. So if you kill the Kujiki, you will disempower Yoshida-style Shinto, and that will make room for new Shinto thoughts and ideas to flourish. And like I said, because the Yoshida-style Shinto is like I said, if you heavily through the documents of the guys who leveled the charges, perfect target. This is so again, the plan is simple. That the attack is not really against some generic and overly simple accusations. Tokugawa Mitsukuni will lead the way. So think about this. You have the Mito domain scholars and a bunch of other Shinto people sort of around the country. Tokugawa Mitsukuni is going to lead the way. This is the guy leading the charge. Okay? Obviously, the document's going to get gishoed, right? If Tokugawa Mitsukuni and a bunch of his Shinto scholars get together and say that this gisho, it's going to become gisho, right? So once the document is gisho, then the Yoshida-style Shinto, which is the different shrines, families, the politicians, etc., they're going to lose a lot of their power and their sway. And it's going to open up a lot of room for revitalization. Then the revitalization is going to be based on the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, because the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki will be safe. And like I said earlier, they could equally have been attacked by the exact same metrics that used to attack the Kujiki, but these guys needed to have some of the Shinto holy texts remaining when the dust settled. So they decided the Yoshida style focuses on Kujiki, we'll kill the Kujiki. We, the revitalist, we will double down on the Nihon Shoki. As I said, once the damage was done, the dust settled, many of these scholars then led the way in several innovations and interpretations of Shinto, all doubling down on a very nationalistic pride level of the Nihon Shoki. So the Nihon Shoki suddenly became the new star holy book. I mean, it was important before, but with the Kujiki now gone, the Nihon Shoki just becomes that much more important. And it's like a national pride boost. All right. Tada Yoshitoshi, for example, right, he doubles down on the Nihon Shoki. Now, Tada Yoshitoshi actually is a student of the Tada Genji, Jingunden, the Tada Genji Oboshiden. So this was a little awkward that he got involved into this attempt to attack, not an attempt, but this effort that destroyed the Kujiki. By destroying the Kujiki, he helped to directly damage the Shotoku Jingunden, right? Because the Shotoku Jingunden had been aligned with the Kujiki aka the Mononobe Ryu Shinto, because of the text. Even though the text may not really have come from Shotoku, the fact that it's supposed to have come from Shotoku meant that the Mononobe Ryu Shinto, the Yoshida Shinto, the Shotoku Jingunden all kind of had a relationship with each other. So by Tada Yoshitoshi just killing the Kujiki, he really just kind of like cuts himself off from the Shotoku Jingunden. However, in response to that though, he then pushes a incredibly Shinto heavy or Shinto only version of the Tada Genji Jingunden, pretty strong. He doubles down on the Oboshiden and the Jimuden. Jimmu is the first emperor, Emperor Jimmu. So, but what's interesting here, of course, is ironically, he doubles down on the Jimuden, but the Jimuden could easily be called out as gisho for the same metrics that the Kujiki was called out as gisho, because there's really no way to prove that the Jimuden does in fact come from Emperor Jimmu. So that's the great irony. So when you read Tada Yoshitoshi's criticism of the Kujiki, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, it's obvious that he's not attacking the Kujiki, he's attacking the Yoshida style of Shinto. And then furthermore, he's obviously not that interested in what is like quote unquote the truth, or the factual, you can prove a truth, because then he goes and he doubles down on the Shinto of the Jimuden, right? Which there's like really no way to know if anything really comes from the Emperor Jimmu or not, right? More than likely the Jimuden is created way later by Genji samurai sort of over time, right? When we say the Tada Genji tradition starts with Tada Mitsunaka, and then from Tada Mitsunaka it continues to just develop, continues to develop, and continues to develop. We understand that the Tada Genji Jingunden and the Tada Genji Oboshiden is a creation over hundreds of years. But Tada Yoshitoshi is trying to say like, oh no, it all goes back to Emperor Jimmu, which is ridiculous considering that he just murdered the Kujiki for making similar claims. So it's interesting, and it's not just Tada Yoshitoshi, it's also like all of the scholars who killed the Kujiki, they all push these very equally absurd Shinto claims. So all of these scholars, their own claims are easily labeled as gisho, but yet they're pushing them. So this even further shows that their motivation wasn't quote unquote what's real, but their motivation was political, right? It's even further proof that this was political, because once they win, they then start pushing their own religious level unprovable claims. So obviously it really was just about politics. So let's bring this to a close by talking about how does this play into Genji traditions. Well, as I showed earlier in the video, the spell, the counting spell, the Norito, that is associated with the 10 treasures, that comes from the Kujiki, and that comes into the Tada Genji tradition. The Oboshiden even finds its way into Fukushima-ryu shinobi teachings. So, like I said, despite the fact that Tada Yoshitoshi's version of the Oboshiden, which is a new Shinto-fied version of the Oboshiden, and it's missing the Buddhism, right? Because he basically wants to cut out anything to do with Shotoku and things to do with Buddhism. It's a very Shinto-only version of the Oboshiden, and it doubles down on the Nihon Shoki and avoids everything to do with the Kujiki, right? That's Yoshitoshi's version of the Oboshiden. The actual Tada Genji material is heavily Buddhist and has references to the Kujiki. So, regardless of the gisho label in the 1600s, in red, this is just undeniable truth. The Kujiki was considered officially true and legit by samurai from the 900s until the late 1600s. After the 1600s, it's no longer officially considered legit, but you still have a lot of individual families and traditions that still believe in it and still use it. That means that there's a lot of generations. So think about this, from 900 to 1600s. That's a lot of generations that took place while the document was believed to be legit by everyone. That's a lot of tradition that is based on or comes out of the Kujiki. A lot, right? It's like 700 something years of traditions stemming from the belief that the document is in fact real. And we already showed this slide at the beginning of the video, but I'm putting it back in here to remind you, just in case you need to sort of be reminded, that teachings from the Kujiki, like the 10 treasures and the Hito, Futamio, Norito, comes from the Kujiki. So, and there's just all kinds of additional things that are just, found here and there throughout the Oboshiden or the Jingunden, etc., and through the, like I said, even popping up in Fukushimaru Shinobi no Jutsu, right? Just related to the Kujiki. So the Kujiki, regardless of what it may be labeled gisho later, for 750 years, it's considered a legit teaching and things are based on it. And with all of this, I'll bring the video to a close. I know that the video was very long and had a lot of different parts, but honestly, there was really no way of addressing this topic without addressing each of these parts. And believe me, I barely scratched the surface on every one of these aspects that we covered. I know it's a long video, seems like I've tapped everything. I can just assure you that this is only the very brief summary of each one of these parts. But so let's close the video with these points. The Kujiki does exist, and it serves as the basis for many aspects of the Jingunden and the Oboshiden. It was a political move in the late 1600s that caused it to be deemed fake, or to become a label as a gisho document. All right, and ever since then, it's been shelved by most Japanese. It's done for, right? It's fake. Put it on the shelf. No one cares. But it contains a lot of ethno-historical data about families, clans, records, religious chants, religious ceremonies, etc., etc. The arguments that are leveled against the document are weak at best, but again, once it was officially labeled gisho, it becomes irrelevant. The book is done for. But now, having said all this, I would ask the viewer, if you, the viewer, consider yourself in any way, shape, or form interested in or studying the Oboshiden, even if you're just studying the Oboshiden by listening to my videos, right? My advice, right, my direction is study the Kujiki, regardless, right? Don't worry that the Kujiki is been labeled gisho, because that is ultimately irrelevant to the Tada Genji tradition. Just because Tokugawa Mitsukuni and his band of Shinto people decided to sort of disempower the Yoshida-style Shinto and sacrifice the Kujiki, that doesn't mean anything to the Oboshiden. So, if you study the Kujiki and somebody says, oh, that's a fake book, no, that's an absurd claim. It's not a fake book. It was labeled gisho for political reasons, but it is definitely from the 900s, with the Japanese lead scholar saying that it's from the 800s, edited in the 900s. So it's from the 800s, edited in the 900s, used by samurai for 750 years until a political coup caused it to be sacrificed as a pawn within the coup. But again, that means nothing to you. If you're an Oboshiden student, you study the Kujiki anyway. All right.